Dr. Van Dyke, thanks for joining today.
It's great to be here. Dr. Van Dyke. I don't get called that very often.
Is that right? Well, you do look more like a Brandon. So, do you mind just introducing yourself for us?
Sure. My name is Brandon Van Dyke. I work for the Witherspoon Institute and the Aquinas Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. I used to be a professor of government and law at Lafayette College, and I'll leave it there for now, but I'm happy to elaborate on any of those things insofar as you'd like me to.
Yeah, well, there's so much to say. So, one thing that's interesting is if you feel comfortable, just talking a little bit about how you moved from Lafayette College to your present position.
Yes, well, I was a professor, an assistant professor at Lafayette College from 2013 to 2021, and I think depending on who you ask, the reasons for my leaving, or different people might give different explanations of why I left, but my analysis of what happened is that I became a political pariah at Lafayette College, and I fault myself for that in large part. And what I mean by that is, while it is true that I had sincere disagreements with my colleagues and the administration regarding the intellectual climate at Lafayette, I don't think that I went about expressing my disagreement in the most effective way. I was too combative and aggressive in dealing with my colleagues and even with students who I considered, um, who I thought were contributing to an intellectual climate on campus that had negative effects on students. So I fault myself for that, um, but I don't fault myself for speaking out against both the orthodoxy itself and the fact that it was informally enforced through ostracism and resulting self-censorship. But anyway, so more specifically, I think around 2017, due to a few factors, that's really 2016, 2017 is when I really began to become concerned about the intellectual climate on campus. And I started a speaker series called the Mill Series. And the idea was to bring people to campus or just to host conversations where we would so we would either bring people to campus who articulated some viewpoint that ran counter to the campus orthodoxy, which was, kind of a cultural leftist progressive orthodoxy, or we would just host events and discuss more right-wing or conservative positions. And I think that there were a few events in particular that we held that garnered a lot of negative attention. So, for example, at some point in 2017, we brought a young lady named Lauren Chen, who at that time went by the pseudonym Roaming Millennial. She was a YouTube host. She's Canadian, but she supported Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and we brought her to campus to talk about why she supported Trump, for the simple reason that Trump had won the election, but almost a year had passed, and not once had we hosted someone who supported the sitting president of the United States to campus. So we just thought it would be interesting. And, we also thought that she's a young woman, so she understands the culture, let's say, of college-age students. Furthermore, she's a woman and she's a person of color, which doesn't matter to me because I don't like that trend in left-wing circles to focus so much on the identity of the speaker rather than the substance of what they're saying. Still, we thought it might make it a more effective event that it's a woman and a person of color rather than, say, an old white man. But it turned out to just be a very controversial event. A ton of students came. A lot of students were really upset, both by the event itself, the very fact that we were having the event, but also because of some of the things she said. And really from that moment on, the Mill series became a kind of lightning rod, and I in particular became a kind of lightning rod on campus. And like I said at the top of this conversation, I was very combative and aggressive often in responding to critiques of the Mill series that I thought were ill-founded and often just slanderous. But it just wasn't very prudent on my part to respond in the aggressive, hostile manner that I did, because I ended up making enemies with my colleagues, with the administration, and ultimately I was denied tenure. And I think, I was naive because I thought that my publication record and my teaching evaluations would enable me to get tenure, even though I was a controversial student or controversial professor. But what I realized is that no, if all your colleagues dislike you, even if by objective criteria you would qualify for tenure, they're going to find a way to deny it to you. And I do think that's what happened to me. So I was denied tenure at Lafayette, and that was really crushing because I loved teaching and I loved research. I loved academia. But fortunately, I landed on my own 2 feet by finding these positions at the Witherspoon and Aquinas Institutes in Princeton. And I think I'm in a position now to say that I am as happy in these positions as I was as a professor at Lafayette. And that's saying a lot because I really loved being a professor at Lafayette. So I'll stop there.
What would you exactly have done differently in your approach to the persecution that you faced?
Well, and I don't want to overstate what I went through. Like, I'm not even sure. It's probably not unreasonable to use the term persecution, but certainly the criticism that I faced, I think that this is a tough one because, I am a sort of warrior by personality. I think that, I've said this to people before. I was born to march into battle. That's kind of my personality.
So warrior, like
A warrior. Yeah,
yeah,
just, and obviously, a lot of human beings and a lot of men in particular have that in them, a kind of aggressive instinct. I like conflict. I'm not at all conflict averse. I actually really enjoy conflict. It makes me come alive. And I'm not saying that's really a good or a bad thing. It's just true. And I do think that, one could make an evolutionary argument about why at least some men are like that. And I really leaned into that aspect of my personality during this period. And I did it in part because it was fun and it was invigorating. And I really did feel indignant at the things that people were saying about me and about the students I was working with and about the Mill Series initiative. But again, it wasn't prudent because I wasn't really looking out for my future self, because because I really wanted to stay at Lafayette. I loved academia. Being a tenured professor in academia, it's a rare privilege these days. And I was very much on my way to enjoying that privilege. And then I sort of sabotaged it. And so what I would have done differently is I think I would have, I do not at all regret expressing my concerns and my critiques of the intellectual climate on campus, and really the intellectual climate in academic scholarship and teaching, and just the intellectual status quo and academic scholarship and teaching. But I think that what I would have done differently is really spent a lot of time getting my arguments together, putting them in writing, and then trying to build coalitions with the more kind of liberal left in order to create organizations, in order to create a kind of broader organization. So rather than creating a kind of dissident organization that I was basically running alone in conjunction with several students, I would have tried to get more professors, administrators, and a wider range of alumni on board, and really tried to set up a long-lasting institution that would have outlived all of us and that would have been dedicated to promoting more intellectual diversity at Lafayette. But instead, I ran this organization that did make a splash for a few years, but ultimately I got booted out. And now that organization doesn't exist anymore. I'm not there anymore. And Lafayette is, less intellectually diverse than it was when I was there, because now I'm not even there. And I was playing a pretty important role in making Lafayette a more intellectually diverse place. So I just don't think it didn't serve me in my own professional aspirations and professional loves, and it didn't serve the students, who I think do deserve to be exposed to a wider range of viewpoints in the classroom and in extracurricular programming. So, and one last thing I'll say is that I work at the Witherspoon Institute now, and the director of the Witherspoon Institute, Luis Tellez, who I know you know also, who actually connected you to me, he's been a real model in this regard because he really has the long game in mind. And he does not make enemies, he makes friends. And he stands on principle, he doesn't lie, he expresses his critiques of trends in the culture and in intellectual and academic life, but he does not unnecessarily alienate people because he understands that tilting the world in a better direction requires forging friendships with others, including people with whom you disagree. And really, I think, again, it's complicated because an interesting question becomes, what does one do with the instinct for conflict and war? Because it is a real aspect of human nature. And again, I think it's, a particularly strong aspect of male nature. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that tribal conflict is a really important part of our evolutionary past. And I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but I think that maybe my mistake was channeling those instincts in the wrong direction. So maybe it's better for me to channel those into sports arenas and maybe like a debate society, instead of sort of treating my ideological opponents as real enemies and foes that I want to sort of dehumanizing them or turning them into the other. I just don't think that, you can't change an institution populated by such people by treating them in that way. It's just not prudent. So, I mean, obviously you can just give up on those institutions and try to create your own. And that is an important aspect of dealing or contending with an orthodoxy or a hegemony that you don't like. But if there are institutions that you want to change and they're populated by your intellectual opponents, you can't just treat them as enemies. You have to treat them as friends and try to persuade and really have, your arguments together.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there is merit to channeling that righteous anger towards solving an injustice, right? And I think we need to see more of that. There's an emasculinization of society, as far as I can tell, and people aren't standing up in defense of the true and the good. And I find it personally inspiring and encouraging to have your perspective. And that's the reason I reached out to you. Is I was facing adversity because of my values, and you're a very strong source of support and prudential counsel, which I greatly appreciate. Um, so, can you tell us now what is the nature of your work and your current position?
Yeah, sure. So the main thing I'm doing is I'm organizing a conference that will be held a little less than a year from now. And so let me back up for a second. The purpose of the conference is it's pretty related to the Mill series in very broad terms, in the sense that my colleagues at the Witherspoon and Aquinas Institutes and I recognize that there is this new set of ideas that has become very potent on not just college campuses, but increasingly in all of our mainstream institutions. I mean, the so-called Great Awakening, and I don't think that's a bad term. So when I say so-called, I don't mean to undermine the notion that a Great Awakening has occurred, but what is sometimes called the Great Awakening, the essence of that phenomenon was that ideas that had been sort of gestating and getting articulated in the academy spilled out of the academy into the media, into the corporate world, into the nonprofit world, in a really big way. And I think that, it began in the 2010s, and then it really sort of accelerated after the death of George Floyd. But anyway, so this set of ideas that I call cultural leftism, some people on the right call it wokeism. It's been given many different names, like identity Marxism, cultural Marxism. I heard someone call it post-Protestant Gnosticism. I mean, there's so many different names for the set of ideas, but I call it cultural leftism. And I call it cultural leftism because cultural as distinct from economic. So economic leftism would be more traditional leftism, where you divide the world into the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and you focus on altering economic arrangements or welfare state arrangements in order to increase material equality between the rich and the poor. Whereas cultural leftism, it's more about dividing the world into identity categories, whites and non-whites, men and women, straight and gays, cisgender, transgender, etc., and focusing on inequality between those groups. So, inequality between cultural groups, not economic groups. Although you are focusing on economic inequality often between cultural groups. And but the essence of cultural leftism is that basically the power, status, and material disadvantages of non-whites, women, and sexual minorities should be the primary focus of our moral attention. That these disadvantages are primarily or exclusively a product of oppression by Western societies, either Western countries oppressing non-Western countries or Western countries oppressing their own minorities. Importantly, that this oppression is systemic and largely invisible. It's inherent in our institutions and even in our concepts and categories. So it's not really a matter of individual or overt bigotry, but instead this more kind of amorphous, systemic, largely invisible oppression. And finally, that, it is incumbent on all of us in Western societies to remedy those disadvantages in a wide variety of ways by allocating resources toward these groups, by treating them in different ways, by giving them a moral free pass, I would argue, because one thing that troubles me is that the groups that are coded as victims, whether it's inner city Black Americans or Palestinians, they're just held to a lower moral standard. And it's a form of redistribution where, where the narrative is that these groups have been oppressed and therefore we don't hold them to the same moral standard that we might hold others. But anyway, so that's the essence of the worldview. And so what I'm doing with the Witherspoon and the Aquinas Institutes, and this is mainly with the Aquinas Institute, is acknowledging that this worldview has become established and very powerful in our society, and that its epicenter and origin is really the university. And okay, so then the question is, what do you do about it? And as I was suggesting earlier, one general strategy. So let me just say also that my colleagues and I at the Witherspoon and Aquinas Institutes generally are critics rather than supporters of this ideology of cultural leftism. So that's where we're coming from. We're critics of it, and I could get into why if you'd like. But we're critics of it, but we recognize that it's very powerful and that there are lots of people who sincerely believe in it. And so then the question is, okay, what do you do about that? Now, one option would be to just create parallel institutions. So just to give up on the universities and create alternative ones like Hillsdale or, New College in Florida or whatever it may be. But the Witherspoon and Aquinas Institute approach is not that. It's rather the approach of reform, where you say, we're not going to just cede Princeton, for example, or other prestigious colleges and universities in the United States to the cultural left. Instead, we're going to establish a presence there and try to improve the intellectual climate at these universities by entering into good faith conversation with adherents of cultural leftism, and also, kind of as I suggested earlier, trying to build relationships with maybe more moderate professors who might have some sympathies with cultural leftism, but also have some concerns about cultural leftism, and try to make alliances with them and start to change curricula and programming so that the intellectual climate on campus changes. And so I know this is a kind of roundabout, long-winded way of answering your question, but the main thing I'm doing for the Aquinas Institute is organizing a conference that will be held a little under a year from now on the Princeton campus. And what we're doing is we're taking diversity, equity, and inclusion and analyzing those concepts and cultural leftism broadly through the lens of Christian and Jewish theology, as well as classical Western philosophy. And the idea is, we're going to take these concepts seriously. We're going to take seriously the notion that diversity is a value, that inclusion is a value, that equity and equality are values. And ask what, okay, are they values? If so, to what extent? And again, we're going to be using theological and classical philosophical tools to answer those questions. And the hope that by doing so will enrich and enlarge the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, perhaps so that it's not so focused on the current concerns of the cultural left, which, as I said, are mainly about white oppression of non-whites, male oppression of women, sexual majorities oppression of sexual minorities. Try to broaden it. So I'll stop there. So that's the main thing I'm doing with the Aquinas Institute. And then in addition to that, for the Witherspoon Institute, I'm giving some seminars and doing some writing on my interests, which are in part what I've described, and I have some other interests as well.
So I think maybe a few months ago, I wouldn't have been so enthusiastic about the approach that you described. But what I've come to realize is when it comes to people who hold, or let's say who promote these values of diversity, equity, inclusion, it seems to me, and I'd like to hear your comments, that maybe there's two camps. One is those who um, knowingly use this as a tool to subvert Western civilization and morality
Mm-hmm.
with the intention of destroying it and perhaps directly or indirectly destroying Christianity. And for instance, we have intellectual examples of that explicitly historically, like Karl Marx and his successors. And I can only imagine there are present day examples of that who we may not be as aware of now as we will be in the future in the history books. But probably most of the adherents of these values are just sincerely wanting to help humanity and doing it in the only way they know of, given that we live in an intellectual and cultural dark age. They haven't read the classical Western tradition, and so their intellectual means of helping humanity is through these culturally Marxist values, which they're unaware of. One of the reasons I came to this conclusion is I spoke with a former professor of mine to dialogue about my values, which she was concerned about on my website, and it became clear to me that she didn't she was unaware that the diversity, equity, inclusion values spring from Marxism, and she was convinced that um, our culture marginalizes so-called sexual or racial minorities. When to me it seems like there's so many indications that it's the reverse, and your career trajectory is a great example of that. That the people who are marginalized are those who hold traditional values. Those are the people that are excluded and whose diversity is not respected. Um, do you have any comments on that?
No, I mean, you put it very well. And I do think it's true. And I think increasingly there's survey evidence to back this up that progressives are not worried about losing their jobs. Conservatives are worried about losing their jobs. And like Republicans are worried about losing their jobs, not Democrats. So in a wide range of workplaces, it's Republicans who don't want to speak publicly or even on social media about their views because they're worried they'll be canceled, whereas Democrats, progressives are not worried about that at all. And Republicans are disproportionately white and male. So, and also just cultural leftism itself, which I do think you could argue is our dominant ideology, at least the dominant ideology of our broad elite and our mainstream institutions. This is a little crude, but basically it characterizes whites and men and straight people as negative, as oppressors, right? It describes them in negative terms, right? So that's a very obvious way in which, I mean, I don't know if marginalization is the right word, but there's a kind of negative stereotyping of the groups that are apparently that are supposedly on top. And obviously affirmative action, which goes far beyond college admissions. I mean, it permeates our entire labor market, and there are a lot of reasons for that, some legal, some cultural, but I mean, that is discrimination, ethnic, racial, gender, and even sexual discrimination that systematically benefits the groups that are supposedly marginalized. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of conservatives, I think, are just like, what is going on? Because it's so frustrating. Like, it's increasingly hard to point to examples of real oppression of the supposedly marginalized groups, and it's quite easy to point to examples of discrimination against the supposedly non-marginalized group. So it's a really good point. And yeah, I mean, I think that I think what you said is very important. You have to kind of distinguish between the people who are very true believers in cultural leftism, because I think, you're no more likely to abandon Christianity than they are to abandon cultural leftism. Like, it's probably a fool's errand to try to get them to give up that set of beliefs. But there are a lot of people who are probably persuadable, or who under different cultural conditions would shift. And in part that's because people do just go along, and I'm not necessarily accusing people of cowardice, but because it's not just that. I mean, people have very good reasons not to sabotage their own careers. They have families to take care of, and so they just keep their head down and don't enter into certain kind of controversial discussions. So I think there are a lot of people like that who, in a different cultural environment, probably would express some of their concerns about cultural leftism, probably do harbor them privately. But I do think also, and this is kind of to your point about your professor, people have been, I would argue, just propagandized. And it's not state propaganda necessarily. It's really propaganda on the part of our academic institutions and our media. I think I would put it slightly different than you, because you talked about the intellectual origins of DEI and how they originate in Marxism. I'm actually not sure I totally agree with that. I think that some aspects of cultural leftism do have Marxist roots, but other aspects don't. I think Yascha Mounk actually makes that clear in a pretty compelling way in his recent book, The Identity Trap, that the intellectual lineage of cultural leftism, or what he calls the identity synthesis, is distinct from Marxism. It goes back to Foucault, Marcuse, Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, who aren't really Marxists and who some ways are explicitly anti-Marxist. I mean, Foucault was anti-Marxist, but even though he had some things in common with him. But anyway, let me get back to the main point, which is, but where I agree with you is that I do think that people have been propagandized, and there are certain really important facts and perspectives that they just haven't heard because they get their information from the mainstream media, whether it's the New York Times or MSNBC or CNN, or from the colleges they went to. And all of these institutions have a very strong culturally left-wing bias, I would argue. And so maybe it'll be better if I give a concrete example. George Floyd in 2020 was killed by a white police officer, Derek Chauvin. And I think that, the reason people care so much about this, I mean, it was a horrible event. I watched the video of it, and it was crushing to watch. And, I felt so sad for George Floyd as I was watching it. So I'm not trying to minimize that at all, the human aspect of this. But it seems that a lot of Americans just accept as fact that police officers in the United States racially discriminate in the application of lethal force, that white police officers and black police officers, controlling for relevant situational factors, are more likely to engage in lethal violence against unarmed black men than they are against unarmed white men or other non-whites. And so, in other words, Americans widely just believe that that is a fact, that there is racial discrimination by police in the application of lethal force. And I've looked into this question somewhat, and there simply is not evidence that that is the case. And yet, if you go to a normal college and read the mainstream media, you will emerge with the impression that that is the case, right? And so I think that, you know, for the people who are more moderate, who aren't deeply invested in this narrative, part of the way that you can bring people, or part of the way, I guess, that you can challenge cultural leftism is just to raise some of these important facts that they're not aware of because they have been propagandized by our mainstream institutions. I mean, I think another more important example of this is that, you know, I would argue, and I'm certainly not the first to argue this, that in our history of the 20th century, we have focused too much, actually, on Nazism and the Holocaust, which obviously was an unbelievably catastrophic, morally horrible event. I'm not denying that at all. But when I say that we've focused too much on it, what I mean is that Hitler has become a kind of Satan figure, and he's really the only form of evil that Westerners feel deep in their bones. But there were so many other forms of evil, including left-wing forms of evil, in the 20th century that people have far less information about. I mean, just the horrors of the famines in the Soviet Union and China, and the political purges carried out by Stalin. And some of the famines, by the way, were intentional and they were genocidal, like the Holodomor of the Ukrainians carried out by Stalin. And just the unbelievable political repression, the Gulag, the Gulag system in the Soviet Union that led so many innocent people to their deaths. And I mean, there examples abound. I mean, the way the Japanese treated the Chinese in the first half of the 20th century just, you know, makes your blood curdle. And yet, if you know, go to normal schools and normal universities in the United States, you sort of only hear about Nazism, and the only thing you worry about is ethno-nationalism and right-wing totalitarianism. You know, but there's left-wing totalitarianism too, and we should be worried about that too. And, you know, I think one problem in Western countries, including the United States, is that we're so worried about right-wing totalitarianism and not sufficiently worried about left-wing totalitarianism. And I would argue that cultural leftism is a kind of proto-left-wing totalitarianism. A lot of the people who are adherents of cultural leftism have unmistakable totalitarian tendencies. They want to subordinate everything to cultural left-wing ideology. They want it to affect how therapy is practiced, right? They want it to constrain comedians, right? They want it to be implicit in the movies people watch. You know, that's what totalitarianism is, when there's an ideology that like insinuates itself into every aspect of culture, and where people are afraid to question it because they will be, you know, canceled or excommunicated. That's what totalitarianism is. And there's much more totalitarianism in the United States coming from the cultural left than there is from the right. But again, because we've been propagandized to believe that the great political threat is right-wing ethno-nationalism, we don't really have much of an immune response to left-wing totalitarianism. And so, yeah, I mean, this is all in response to what you said about your professor, because what you said just reminded me that People have been propagandized, and part of the way you combat cultural leftism is to tell people about facts, whether it's police violence today or facts about history, like the role of left-wing totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. Just to tell people about those facts so that they recognize that um, that cultural leftism sort of succeeds because people are unaware of or ignorant of those facts.
Yeah, great points.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks for correcting me on the distinction between Marx and other contemporary philosophers. Um,
Well, I mean, and it's just my opinion. You could be right. I mean, there are, like, for example, I think James Lindsay would largely agree with you. Like, he wrote a book called Race Marxism, where he thinks that cultural leftism definitely has a Marxist roots. So I just wanted to, there's sort of a debate, I think, among critics of wokeism about what the best way to think about the ideology is. To what extent is it a mutation of Marxism, and to what extent does it have an independent lineage? And I think I'm somewhere in the middle there. But I'm not, you could be right. So I'm not trying to tell you that I'm right and you're wrong or anything like that.
well, let's put it this way: whether I happen to be right or wrong, you are much more informed on the issue than I am. Although I wonder if what we could all agree on is that, regardless of which particular strain of philosophy it comes from, it's under the genre of secular humanism, which comes from, like, Protagoras has a great definition of it. Um, Man is the measure of all things, the things that they are, the things that are not, that they are not. So man is sufficient for himself. He has total autonomy. He decides what reality is. And I think that's basically the religion of the New World Order, which uh, which we're all beholden to without even realizing it, because it's not articulated explicitly, because people are not even educated enough to recognize it.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said, it really kind of sets my mind ablaze because um, it sort of raises the question of where all of this comes from. And I, one way of restating what you just said is that we're living in a kind of post-Christian secular age, and these ideologies that have taken over have sort of filled the vacuum created by um, the absence of a real religious structure like Christianity. And I do think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, a very important question is, like, where did this ideology come from? And we've talked a little bit about the intellectual lineage, and a lot of the books that have come out are about the intellectual lineage, whether it's Christopher Rufo's book or Yasha Monk's book. And some other books are about, like, the roots of the ideology in civil rights law, like Richard Hanania's book. But I think that the deeper explanation of where this ideology comes from, it has to do with history, like the fact that we had Nazism in the Western world, but we didn't have communism, but also major sociological, demographic, and structural shifts that have unfolded over generations, including, very importantly, de-Christianization. I mean, Western Europe is, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the percentage of the population in Western European countries like France and Germany and Spain and Italy that go to church on a regular basis is very low. The United States for a while was kind of an outlier, but now the United States is rapidly secularizing. Like, the change in the last 15 years is really quite remarkable. We're basically Europeanizing with regard to religion very quickly. And it's kind of become a cliche at this point, but what's important is whether it's true or not. The cliche being that people are inherently religious, and if there isn't a kind of traditional religion on offer, then they will create a new one. I do think there's a lot of truth to that, because religion satisfies the deepest longings of the human soul. We need to kind of lose ourselves in a vision of the future and in a meaningful set of goals and values. And we're going to find a way to do that, unless some people can be just hedonistic and nihilistic, but I think most people and cultures as a whole can't be. And so, yeah, I think that cultural leftism serves as a kind of religious structure for a significant percentage of, especially the college-educated population in the United States and in the Western world. And it's interesting because the people, like the true believers in cultural leftism, they do tend to be college educated, and they also tend to be secular, right? Like working class Americans, working class Black Americans, Latinos, and whites are, I think, more likely to go to church or to be Christian. College educated Americans are less likely to be Christian, less likely to go to church. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's true. And so, even from that point of view, it kind of makes sense. Those who no longer go to church and adhere to Christianity have latched onto this new ideology. So, yeah.
So let me just offer another perspective on the George Floyd case. So if you look at the video that's taken, I believe in front of Derek Chauvin, it looks like his knees on his neck. But if you look at the video it's taken behind him, it's clear that his knees on his shoulder, his left shoulder. And furthermore, it was found in the autopsy that his blood contained, George Floyd's blood contained a lethal dosage of fentanyl, like
Mm-hmm.
far beyond the lethal threshold. He had fentanyl pills in his car. There's no history or evidence of any racism on the part of Derek Chauvin in his career as a police officer. Anyways, it's just to see the extent of the propaganda that I'm taking this. If you want more detail, there's a great documentary by Candace Owens called "Follow the Money," greatest lie ever sold.
Yes, I've heard about this. I've not seen it, but yeah, that's so. Is your view that Derek Chauvin was wrongly convicted of murder?
As far as I can see from all the evidence points towards that. Yeah.
Yes. So that's interesting. I'm ignorant of this issue. I would need to learn more about it. But if that's the case, that's horrible. And uh, regardless of the situation with Derek Chauvin, I do think that many people have been sacrificed on the altar of this new ideology. I mean, I feel that in a very small way I was. Like my career was just kind of put into the meat grinder. And I worry about you too, Johann. Like just, based on what you shared with me about the pressure that is being put on you for making your values explicit on your website, and the fact that, you know, some people are raising questions about whether it's consistent with the American Psychological Association's values and best practices. I think that, I hope that nothing ultimately comes of it, but, just in the extreme case that it did, I mean, I think there are lots of stories like this in the United States and Western world where people are being unjustly, again, sacrificed on the altar, scapegoated, um, the
Well,
altar of this new ideology.
yeah. I mean, here's the thing: civilization is so fragile. C.S. Lewis said, "Civilization, they're islands on a sea of barbarism, basically."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm really inspired by uh, what you said about like being a warrior. I The more I read history, the more convinced I am that for civilization to exist, there need to be people who are willing and able to sacrifice their own personal material well-being, physical well-being for the sake of society.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. And I mean, I think men in particular, that's what we're born to do. Like that's what we're designed for. Um, and I think, I mean, again, I think what's important is to find the correct, the right ways to allocate that very noble primal energy, you know, um, because sometimes it can be misplaced, it can be misdirected, um, but it shouldn't be repressed, and it certainly shouldn't be demonized. And I do worry about that. I think that we were talking about how de-Christianization is an important structural contributor to cultural leftism. Another one is the fact that you said, I think you referred to the emasculation of society, and yeah, I mean, I don't know what the best way to put this is, but basically, the academy and the workforce and our political system has become much less male dominated. Women are playing a much larger role in higher education, in the corporate world, um, in the political system. And I'm not making an argument about whether that's good or bad, but I do think that cultural leftism and this focus on the victim and this kind of maternal compassion for weak, defenseless, downtrodden people, um, and this kind of almost maternal rage at anyone who is insensitive to or perceived as threatening to these, downtrodden victims. I do think that whole set of urges is more feminine than masculine. And certainly the willingness to enforce conformity at the expense of truth, to prioritize consensus over honest truth seeking and the disagreement that results from that. I do think that shift in values, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support this, is a function of women playing a more prominent role in our institutions. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because I'm sure there are many reasons why that's a good thing. But I think one negative effect of that is that it's leading to a lot of repression of primal and potentially noble male instincts. um, and yeah, I used to joke that the academy is now populated by women and the kind of men who nod along to everything that women say, which sounds maybe a bit misogynistic, and I don't mean it that way at all. But you know, you don't get that rough, kind of raw masculine energy in the academy at all. Or maybe you do, but it's in kind of secondary, like marginal parts of the academy.
Well, I wonder if, in addition to that factor, that men themselves are more feminine.
Yeah,
Decrease in testosterone levels, increase in estrogen due to just the ubiquity of artificial contraceptions. I mean, microplastics have been cited. Also, the pandemic of pornography addiction that we're experiencing. So I think all these things are taking away the edge of masculinity.
yeah, that's interesting, because I've heard about this drop in testosterone, but I haven't looked into what's causing it. Um, so I've heard about the microplastics explanation. I'm very concerned about pornography, but I didn't realize that was leading to a potential reduction in testosterone. What's the mechanism there?
It's a good question. I haven't studied it directly,
Mm-hmm.
but to use like a historical example, men in battle, they would be separate from their wives before on the eve of battle, right?
Yes.
Because so that they'd have this greater ferocity, greater drive,
Yes.
higher testosterone.
I've heard that some soccer coaches do the same. They say abstain from sex for 2 days before the game. Um, I see what you're saying. So people are just, frankly, they're masturbating all the time, and
Right.
right, it's kind of
Yeah.
draining them of that vital masculine energy. Yeah, yeah, I can see
Yeah.
that.
Or like cohabitation versus having the need to. Well, I really need to uh, form as a man for my wife by being able to support myself professionally
Right,
and to seek her out through adversity and win her over through my personal charm and virtues, rather than make a scary decision of making a commitment in order to win her over, rather than just having the like easy easy decision of just sliding into it.
right.
You mentioned there's this overemphasis on Nazism, under an emphasis on the dangers of socialism, and my observation is in part that's due to this successful effort from the Jewish people of advertising the evil of the Holocaust,
Hmm.
through informing people through Holocaust museums. And the more people are aware of history and the mistakes that have been made, the better. And there, maybe there isn't as much of an organization to show the evils of socialism. We know more people died as a result of Stalin's regime than Hitler's, and more people died as a result of Mao's regime than Stalin's.
Right,
And then Jordan Peterson also points out that it's more difficult to identify when socialism goes too far. Like, whereas with, uh, although I guess Nazism is considered National Socialism, but
yeah, but
considered more right wing, they the dividing line there is discrimination on the basis of race. That's like a clear sign of going too far.
Mm-hmm.
And Peterson's point is, well, yeah, it's difficult to pick that line when it comes to socialism, but he believes it's when compelled when speech is compelled, which is why he took such a fervent stand against compelled speech. And I think that's what we're facing now here. But
Yeah, yeah. I
Martin
think. I
announced.
mean, I mean, I do think it's true that right, because there's a very large Ashkenazi Jewish population in the United States, especially, and Ashkenazi Jews, because the Holocaust targeted Ashkenazi Jews, like because there are also Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews, but the Holocaust targeted Ashkenazi Jews, which are the Eastern European Jews. And there's a very large Ashkenazi Jewish population in the United States. Basically, almost all, this is actually true of Jews in general. I think almost all of the Jews in the world are either in Israel or in the United States. I mean, there's some elsewhere, but the vast majority are in those two places. But yes, I mean, Ashkenazi Jews in particular, they're an incredibly successful group. They have like a really high IQ on average, and they're heavily overrepresented. And I don't mean that in a negative way. They're just like statistically overrepresented in media, entertainment, all kinds of areas, academia. And it's not because of any conspiracy, it's just because they're a very successful group. But one thing that leads to is like they shape the narrative more than other groups might. And yes, that could be part of the reason why the Holocaust figures so prominently in the American and Western historical understanding. I do think it's also important, though, that ethno-nationalist totalitarianism, violent anti-Semitic totalitarianism, did occur in the Western world. It occurred in Germany. And no left-wing totalitarian regime ever took power in Western Europe or in any of its settler colonies. Whereas in Eastern Europe, you had a really heavy dose of left-wing totalitarianism. And as a result, Eastern Europeans have a much stronger immune response to left-wing totalitarianism to this day. Like they're much less susceptible to cultural leftism, to immigration, all of this stuff. They're much less susceptible than Western Europeans and North Americans are. So I think that that's another factor, just the fact that we never experienced left-wing totalitarianism in the way that Eastern Europe and Russia did. There was something else you said that I wanted to respond to. Oh yeah, about how you draw the line. Like when has the left gone too far, to restate Jordan Peterson's question. Yeah, I also, I mean, I think that there are a couple of things I would say about that. I mean, I think that one problem with what we've learned about Nazism and World War II and then the Holocaust is that it's made us afraid of ethnic nationalism. And I don't think that, my personal view is that we shouldn't be afraid of ethnic nationalism. I mean, obviously, we should be afraid. I think when people start talking about other ethnic groups as cockroaches and vermin, and speaking about other ethnic groups in really negative terms, and talking about wanting to cleanse your society of them or something, like that's all very concerning. But the notion that your polity should have ethnic coherence or ethnocultural coherence, I don't think that's a crazy idea. In fact, I think there are a lot of reasons why that makes sense. And I think one thing that's hurting Western countries is that they've lost their ethnocultural coherence. And so increasingly, they're really not nations. They're just like, agglomerations of people who don't really have that much in common with each other. And that's a real problem for a variety of reasons. So I think one negative consequence of this historical focus on the Nazis is that it's made us immune to healthier forms of ethnic nationalism. And anyone who even raises the possibility that maybe the country would function better if it had an ethnic supermajority is considered like a dangerous right-wing lunatic. And I don't really think that's a crazy idea. I mean, most countries in the world are ethnic nations, effectively, like China, South Korea, Japan, Mexico. Like these are all, Eastern European countries. Like, they have ethnocultural coherence, and that's not a bad thing. Because the nation is a kind of extended family. But I do think there are forms of ethno-nationalist discourse that should raise our that should set off alarm bells. Yeah, but on the left, I mean, I think that for me, the key, like the left goes too far when it starts saying that outcome inequality is unjust.
Mm.
Like that's what, Marxism is one form of that, where really any economic outcome inequality is unjust. Cultural leftism, the idea is that outcome inequality between groups within a capitalist system is unjust. And I think that's really dangerous, because I think groups left to their own devices do not perform equally. And so in order to achieve outcome parity, you have to basically, um, you know, redistribute a lot of wealth and not allow meritocracy to operate. And that's bad, because meritocracy is the foundation of high functioning systems. And I do think we're witnessing a pretty serious assault on meritocracy in the United States, especially, and also Western Europe, because there's this really like fixation on getting equal representation of ethnic groups, racial groups, men and women, across our economy and polity, even though there are differences in ability and interest that lead to disparate outcomes between these groups.
Mm.
Um, so I think so the equity part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that's where the alarm bells should be going off regarding when the left has gone too far. I mean, I agree also that compelled speech, really any form of a liberalism, well, actually, I'm not sure any form of a liberalism is bad. I mean, there's some very interesting debates happening right now within, especially the conservative intelligentsia, about liberalism itself and whether it's flawed. So set
Mm.
that aside. But like compelled speech, I'm not disagreeing that that's also a potential. Yeah, or I would agree that that is also a sign that a political movement has gone too far when it starts compelling speech.
Yeah, well said. Well, I wish we could continue this conversation. I wanted to hear more about how much hope you have in the success of your endeavors. Maybe if you could just end with a word there.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about this conference we're going to be holding in less than a year, and it's really been a great learning experience for me, because we've been doing some working groups in the lead up to it, and we brought together a group of theologians, and their theological examinations of concepts like diversity, equity, equality, dignity, inclusion, recognition, belonging, friendship and enmity, lamentation, grace. I've really learned so much, because those weren't areas that I was particularly well versed in before taking these positions at the Aquinas and Witherspoon Institute. So it's been a really great learning experience for me, and it's turned me on to a bunch of authors I hadn't read before. Like I'm reading Alistair MacIntyre now for the first time, and really enjoying his book After Virtue, which is quite profound. But anyway, I'm hopeful that the conference will go well. I'm doing everything I can to ensure that it will, and I hope that coming out of that, we'll develop a framework for talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion that we can then share with others, both in conversation and just share through materials with other universities, so that they can start to talk about these concepts that are entrenched in a different and better way. So we'll see where it goes. We're doing our best.
Yeah, look forward to hearing what you come up with.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining, and thanks for all the work you do, Brandon.
Johann, it was great to join you. And yeah, I hope we can talk again soon. Thank you so much for having me. And I wish you, the best of luck with everything that you're doing, this podcast, your practice, etc.
Thanks so much, man.